There's something deeply telling about a transaction that almost nobody in Western media wants to examine honestly. Iran has placed an order for Russian military helicopters, and if you've been following the slow tectonic shifts in Eurasian geopolitical architecture over the past several years, you already sense that this isn't simply a weapons deal. This is a signal, a deliberate, calculated message sent not just between Tehran and Moscow, but to every capital in the world that has been watching the gradual erosion of American unipolar dominance. And here's the critical realization I want you to hold on to as we move through this conversation, because I'll come back to it near the end. The most dangerous thing about this helicopter deal isn't the hardware itself, it's what it reveals about the structure of a new world that is being quietly assembled, piece by piece, while most Americans are still debating yesterday's headlines. Let's talk about what's actually happening here and why it matters far more than the mainstream framing suggests. To understand the Iran-Russia helicopter deal in its full dimension, you first have to strip away the reflexive framing that Western media instinctively applies to anything involving these two countries. The moment you hear Iran and Russia in the same sentence in most American newsrooms, a well-rehearsed script activates. Words like rogue, authoritarian, destabilizing begin to appear, and before any genuine analysis can take place, the conversation has already been channeled into a familiar moral corridor that prevents real thinking. But you're here because you're tired of that corridor, so let's step outside it entirely. Russia and Iran have been drawing closer for years now, but the pace and depth of that convergence has accelerated dramatically since 2022. When the United States and its European partners imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia following the conflict in Ukraine, they believed, and this is worth pausing on, they genuinely believed that economic isolation would fracture Russia from within. What actually happened was the opposite. Russia was pushed with considerable urgency into the arms of partners it had previously engaged with only cautiously. Iran was one of those partners, and what started as a relationship of mutual convenience has steadily matured into something considerably more structural. The helicopter deal is one visible expression of that maturation. Now, what helicopters are we talking about, and why does the specific nature of the hardware matter? Reports indicate Iran is seeking a substantial fleet of Russian rotary-wing aircraft, with the Mi-28 attack helicopter and the Mi-17 transport variant among the platforms under discussion. The Mi-28, known in NATO circles as the Havoc, is a serious piece of military engineering, a dedicated tank killer and close air support platform that has been battle-tested in Syria, in Libya, and most recently in the grinding attritional warfare of Ukraine. It is not a defensive system. It is a weapon designed to project force, to suppress ground formations, and to operate in high-threat environments. The Mi-17, meanwhile, is the workhorse of Russian military logistics, capable of moving troops, supplies, and equipment across difficult terrain with remarkable reliability. Iran, acquiring both types, tells you something important about Iranian military ambition. They are not simply looking to fill gaps in their existing inventory, they are looking to develop a genuinely capable combined arms force that integrates air power with ground operations in a far more sophisticated way than their current capabilities allow. But to understand why this matters on a regional level, we have to look at the geography of Iranian influence and where helicopters actually change the military equation. Iran projects power across a vast arc, from Lebanon through Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and into the broader Persian Gulf region. Much of this influence is exercised through proxy relationships, through the provision of weapons, training, and advisory support to groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and various Shia militias in Iraq. The problem with rotary wing assets from a strategic perspective is that they are far harder to transfer to proxy forces than missiles or drones. Helicopters require trained pilots, maintenance infrastructure, spare parts supply chains, and secure operating bases. This means that if Iran is acquiring military helicopters from Russia, the primary beneficiary of that capability is the Iranian military itself, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the conventional Iranian army. And that shifts the strategic calculus in ways that planners in Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and Washington are paying very close attention to right now. Here's where I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this rather than react to it. When you look at a country like Iran, one that has been under comprehensive American sanctions for over 4 decades, and you see it successfully negotiating a sophisticated military procurement deal with a major power, what does that tell you about the actual effectiveness of sanctions as a foreign policy tool? Because the official American position for the better part of half a century has been that economic pressure, sustained and escalated over time, would eventually produce behavioral change in Tehran. What we actually observe is an Iran that has developed domestic ballistic missile capability, domestically produced drones that have proven effective enough that Russia itself sought them for use in Ukraine, a nuclear program that continues to advance, and now an incoming fleet of Russian attack helicopters. At what point does the strategy demand honest reassessment? I'll leave that question open, because the answer is more uncomfortable than most Washington analysts are willing to admit publicly. The Russia angle here deserves its own careful examination. Moscow's willingness to provide advanced military hardware to Tehran represents a significant departure from the more cautious posture Russia maintained during the earlier phases of its partnership with Iran. For years, Russia was quite deliberate about calibrating its arms transfers to avoid triggering a direct confrontation with Israeli or American red lines. The S-300 air defense system sale to Iran was delayed for years under Russian-imposed moratoriums, partly as a result of Israeli and American pressure. The geopolitical environment that allowed that kind of pressure to constrain Russian behavior has fundamentally changed. Russia is now in a position where it needs Iran not just as a weapons customer, but as a genuine strategic partner. Iran has supplied Russia with Shahed drones that have been used extensively in Ukraine. Iran has provided ammunition. Iran has provided technical expertise. The helicopter deal in this light is partly reciprocal. Moscow is paying back a debt in the currency that Tehran values most, which is military capability. There is also a deeper structural logic at work here that connects to something I want you to sit with for a moment. The Russia-Iran military relationship is not happening in isolation. It is embedded within a broader framework of Eurasian realignment that includes China's deepening economic engagement with both countries, the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the growing role of BRICS as an alternative economic architecture, and the explicit effort by multiple non-Western nations to create financial systems that operate outside of dollar dominance. When you place the helicopter deal inside that larger frame, it stops looking like a bilateral transaction and starts looking like one thread in a very large tapestry. And the tapestry tells a story about a world in which American primacy, which has been the organizing assumption of global order since 1991, is being actively contested not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through thousands of quiet, incremental moves that collectively add up to a structural transformation. Now, I want to bring in something that most analysis of this deal misses entirely, and this connects to that critical realization I flagged at the beginning of our conversation. The helicopter deal between Iran and Russia is not being finalized in a vacuum of international law or diplomatic norms. It is happening in the context of a transformed United Nations arms embargo situation. For years, UN Security Council resolutions, specifically Resolution 2231, which was part of the framework of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, placed strict limits on conventional arms transfers to Iran. The United States withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, and in 2020, the arms embargo provisions of Resolution 2231 expired, as they were always scheduled to do under the original agreement. The United States attempted to trigger a snapback mechanism to restore those restrictions, an effort that was widely rejected by other Security Council members as legally invalid, given America's own withdrawal from the agreement. The result is that Iran is now, under the current framework of international law as interpreted by most of, there is something uniquely revealing about what a nation chooses to do in the hours immediately after a peace deal. Not weeks later, not after the ink has dried and the cameras have gone home, but in the very days when the world is still celebrating the end of hostilities. While American headlines were fixating on Trump's triumphant declaration, "Let the oil flow," later and the prospect of a Switzerland signing ceremony, Tehran was quietly signing a very different kind of document in Moscow. Iran's Red Crescent chief was putting pen to paper on a memorandum of understanding for the direct purchase of 20 helicopters from Russia, aimed at strengthening the logistics and aerial relief fleet of the country. 20 helicopters from Russia, days after a US-Iran peace deal was announced. That timing is not accidental, that timing is a message. And if you want to understand the true architecture of global power in 2026, you need to learn how to read those messages, because they tell you far more than any press conference ever will. Most people watching the news right now are operating with half the picture. They see the ceasefire, they see Trump taking a victory lap, they see oil tankers finally preparing to move through the Strait of Hormuz, and they conclude that the United States has won something, that the pressure campaign worked, that Iran blinked. But here is the critical realization I want you to hold in your mind as we move through this analysis together, one that I will fully unpack in the final stretch of this conversation. Iran is not behaving like a nation that has surrendered. Iran is behaving like a nation that has survived, recalculated, and is now methodically rebuilding on its own sovereign terms. And the helicopter deal is the first, clearest proof of that. To understand why this matters, we have to go back and look at the full picture of what has just transpired in the Middle East, because the mainstream framing has flattened something extraordinarily complex into a very simple story. The conflict began in earnest on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel began strikes on Iranian targets. Trump characterized the operations as major combat actions intended to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, destroy its missile capabilities and navy, and limit its regional influence. 100 and some days of direct military engagement between the United States and Iran, something that would have seemed almost unthinkable just 18 months prior, and yet here we are. And in the middle of all of that, something that the cable networks essentially glossed over was already unfolding beneath the surface. As early as February 23, 2026, reporting based on leaked Russian documents indicated that Iran had quietly begun receiving Russian Mi-28 NE Night Hunter attack helicopters as part of a wider €500 million arms package with Moscow. Iran was assessed to have taken delivery of up to 6 Mi-28s in January, with at least one aircraft reportedly operated over the capital that month. Let that sink in. While the US and Iran were engaged in active hostilities, Russia was delivering attack helicopters to Tehran. The alliance was not paused for the war, it was accelerated by it.